Often these terms, when spoken in a casual manner, denote the same thing. Yet in the light of direct experiences, they are not. They are very different states of consciousness altogether. And we're going to see how and why. Needless to say that there is no enlightenment without self-realization, and there is no self-realization without awakening. All these terms are intimately interconnected. It's quite obvious. In order for the self to realize itself, it has to awaken first from this state of complete identification with the object of experience. However, the awakened is not necessarily self-realized, and self-realized is not necessarily fully enlightened in full measure of that term. Some people who have heard me speaking in some of the YouTube podcasts, or those who have read, let's say, some of my participations in internet discussions and some blogs, have noticed me often using the term the expansion of consciousness, the expansion of awareness. And that somehow presupposes that there is no possibility or there is no degree to determine the exact moment in time or exact point in time where we could say that this is enlightenment and everything prior to that is not. And likewise everything after that, everything is. No matter how perplexing this sounds, this has a lot of truth to it. And we're going to find out, even on that very introspective way through intellectual inquiry. So, before we go into it fully, it will be good if we can slightly go through the characteristics of each term and what it denotes, what each of these terms actually presupposes and tries to convey. What is awakening? Well, from what we have been spoken about before, we know that there are types of awakening, and that these types of awakening are not necessarily all the same. Some awakenings are just a steer. Consciousness is being steered. There is a slight shift, there is something definitely going on. The experiences themselves conveying that there is indeed something happening. However, that is awakening, which is still can be defined as a steer. Aside from that, there are different types of awakening in respect to there is higher awakening, there is lower awakening. There are intermediate awakenings, higher, lower versus, this is when the awakening takes place in, let's say, in the areas of the psychic centers which are not necessarily associated with that classical tantric view of awakening taking place in the root chakra, like in Muladhara in this case. Other than types of awakening, there are degrees of awakening. There is full awakening, when we know for sure that the whole system woken up. The self has woken up to itself within this body, and there is no doubt about it. There are partial awakening. Partial awakening is this what most people experience, and they mistaken that for a truly full awakening, and they are often left in limbo because from the books talks and some of the teachings, the experiences that they are being granted with, giving them a sense that this is it, this is awakening. However, it's not full awakening because it is not followed by the, let's say, greater degrees of transformation. The process of transformation itself is not ushered. Why? Because it's not full awakening, it's a partial awakening. It's just some energy is being released. Some energy, some of that sacred energy being released. Yet that's not enough to drive the process. There are improper awakening, there are complications. All of these are themes in their own right, and I hope we will have time to address them, each of them, in a series of talks. However, the aim of our current discussion is to keep your awareness on the distinction between these three terms often used today, such as awakening, self-realization, and enlightenment. What is each of them in its own right? How do they connect? And what makes them different? Now, self-realization. Self-realization, obviously, it's the sequentially unfolding state from awakening. And self-realization is characterized by the self is being realized on the level of direct experience. And many of you who have experienced that know exactly what we are talking about. It's when we palpably experience our self as separate from the field of activity. We experience the self as it is within. And that often brings a profound state and profound shift in perception. We perceive the inner realm of the self within and the outer world as a reflection of that self, however different from the self that we perceive within. This is known technically as cosmic consciousness. The self realizes itself via direct means, palpably within, yet the polarity is often widened. The polarity between this self and that world, or that self and this world, is often become in opposition to each other. When one has direct and palpable experience of the chariot driver, or the chariotee, rather than chariot with the horses, you see, so it's a shift in perception. It's a radical shift. When we talk about enlightenment, and let me emphasize once again that there is no enlightenment unless there is a self-realization took place first. Self-realization, it's the prelude to enlightenment. It's the dawn, it's the awakening itself to itself that will be blossomed in the full state of enlightenment. In enlightenment, there is no world. All this is perceived as the self. There is no longer anything that one cannot say that this is self. It is complete in itself, and there are no partial enlightenment because there is no subject and object relationship left any longer. Do you see what is being said here? In self-realized state, in a state of self-realization, there is a distinction between subject and object, between the seer and the seen. In the state of enlightenment, seer and the seen are indistinguishable. Subject and object no longer exist. So for that reason, we say that enlightenment cannot be partial or impartial. It cannot be, let's say, 70% of enlightenment and 30% of non-enlightenment. It cannot even be 99% against 1% of ignorance. It's either or. And that what makes tremendous difference between the two other states. Awakening can be anything in between. Self-realization is still degrees, the degrees to which self realizes itself. In enlightenment, there is no degrees whatsoever, because there is nothing and no one to realize anything anymore. There is no subject. Because what we did now, we just kind of mapped the territory. We gave that very brief assessment of what constitutes, the characteristics of each state of consciousness, which in the spoken word are often have been referred to as awakening, self-realization, enlightenment. And indeed, in some intelligent conversations, when one says he or she is awakened, that could denote being enlightened. Or he or she is self-realized. Very often in books, in discourses and dialogues, when we say so-and-so is self-realized, that means that that person is enlightened. But I hope you understand where we are coming from here. The purpose of this discussion is to show this whole process from awakening to enlightenment as sequential unfoldment. So there is no gray areas left as to understand how it works and what principles guide this process. But despite the fact that everything may be still somehow shrouded in mystery, it is all shrouded in mystery as long as we do not know and not aware. Soon as this whole kind of picture becomes much more coherent within our own intellectual grasp, that in itself creates the possibility for that process to become into a fuller cognition in much greater degree and in much faster. So we would talk about experience now. In order for any experience to take place, and that's in the nature of consciousness, there has to be subject, object, and the process itself, right? So there have to be observer, process of observation, and observed. In other words, subject experiencing object. It's simple, it's very straightforward, it's logical. In order for any experience to take place, there have to be the existence and connectivity between these three values of consciousness, also known in Vedic tradition as Samhita of Rishi, Devata and Chandas. For those of you who are not familiar with that terminology, Rishi stands here for the seer, the Devata stands for the seeing, and Chanda stands for the seen. Chanda stands for the object. So, let's say when we perceive a tree, when we see a tree, tree is an object, and the one who sees is subject in this case. And the process of perceiving, seeing that tree, it's that experiencing, it's that experience, which leads us to a very simple and tentative, at this state tentative, and once you reflect upon that with greater degree, right? And with repeated practice, you will see how simple that is and how beautiful everything is interconnected in nature. We will see also why it is correct to say that in a way there is no ignorance and there is no enlightenment, in a way, but let us see first the process. Let us see how does it all work together and how does it all sits together. So if we presuppose that the intimate relationship between these three qualities of consciousness, such as seer, the process of seeing, and seen, are absolutely necessary for any experience to take place, for any cognition of this world to take place, then when we examine closer different states of consciousness, we will see how each of these values of consciousness dominates over the other. For instance, in avidya or ignorance, in the ignorant state of consciousness, like in the spiritual terminology, something like, what constitutes ignorance is when the quality of object dominates both subject and the process of experiencing. The tree that we see, or any object for that matter, takes a precedent over this whole process. It completely overwhelms us. The object dominates. The value of object dominates in that very complex relationship between the subject, object, and the process. We will go slower. It may sound simple for some and not so simple for others, simply because maybe certain terminologies, certain ways of conveying has not been yet encountered. However, it's not that difficult. What then happens in awakening, as opposed to that example with the state of ignorance, where the object dominates both the seer and the seeing? In awakening, there is a shift in perception. The object no longer dominates. And in some cases, the awakening can be so rapid and full, then the subject, which at this state is still could be overshadowed, comes on top as the main value of consciousness. So, do you see the difference? What happens then in turn in self-realization is that quality of subject is fully cognized itself, and it's starting to dominate over both object and experience. And that is known as the witnessing state of consciousness, greater degree of awareness. It is the state of consciousness often described as cosmic state of consciousness, we've spoken about before. And of course there are degrees, there are degrees of intensity, and there are degrees to which the subject is being in the driving seat of all experiences. However, in general, this is what is the case. The subject is no longer overshadowed. The seer is no longer overwhelmed by the seen and the process of seeing. No matter what's happening, There's a tree, one enjoys the value of that experience for what it is, yet the witnessing of the tree is not overshadowed. It does not create a shadow that casts over the seer, where seer is lost in the experience or lost in the object. Do you see the difference? Self-realization is where the self is being realized, yet still perceived as separate from the field of activity. So the seer sees the object. The seer still experiences. However, there is duality present. So the whole business of complete integration and cognition is not complete. What is happening in enlightenment is very interesting. It's when the seer and the seen merge completely. They become indistinguishable. There is no longer difference between the seer and the seen. The one who perceives, right, is merged with that what is being perceived. What is left is only the process of seeing. The rishi and chandas, the subject and object, annihilate each other. They are completely dissolved. And one could say that what is left is devata, the process itself. Only seeing is left. That's what makes enlightenment complete and unique. Because there is nothing that one sees other than one's own self. When that happens, it is complete in its own right. As we've said earlier, simply because there is no longer subject left. There is no longer one left who could claim that experience. So when we talk about awakening, self-realization and enlightenment, we bear in mind that between all these different states and values of consciousness, there is something at work, a very subtle relationship that is basically making a qualitatively different experience possible because of the mutability and changeability of what value dominates at each given condition, situation. So if we look at it in retrospect, right? If we look at it in retrospect, if we now just look at this whole process of Rishi Devata Chandas, of seer, seeing and seen, that is always present. Whenever there is experience, it's always present. It's impossible otherwise. Then we could say that ignorance doesn't exist. There's no such thing like ignorance. You can replace that with the term, it's the value of object dominating experience itself and the subject. In the same way, in enlightenment, subject and object annihilate each other, they are dissolved completely. All is left is experience. And in all the intermediate and previous states, all this was experience. All this was experience. The quality of devata. The value of devata is all there is. But the degree with which consciousness appreciates its own value gives rise to what we call and what we distinguish on a mental level, all these different states and all these different states of consciousness, all these different experiences. In modern spirituality, in New Age, that some people say that self-realization, enlightenment, doesn't exist, it's impossible. How can, and they're very, very often, that kind of statements are often backed up with quite a coherent exposition. So we've looked at it now from a very different perspective. We looked at it from the Vedic perspective, from the perspective of the values of consciousness. And just to throw a seed for your future interest, right, is that the whole relationship of Rishi Devata Chandas is present on our DNA. It actually reflects through the DNA itself. The DNA itself carries that mutable relationship where the quality of seer, seen, and seeing are in mutual interconnective relationship, which gives rise this very human body. With the help of instrumentality, which in this case devata, the devata, the instrumentality of consciousness, which is experience itself.